Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all joining us for this UN Global Compact Academy session, delivering on net positive water impact for growth and resilience. I'm Amanda Biloski of the Pacific Institute, moderator for today's session. As co-secretariat of the UN Global Compact CEO Water Mandate and its Water Resilience Coalition, the Pacific Institute conceptualized and has been collaboratively advancing this specific definition of net positive water impact since 2019. Net positive water impact, or NPWI, is arguably the most ambitious commitment companies are making on water at the enterprise level. Today's Academy session will highlight the pressing need for ambitious action on water to build water resilience and meet the Sustainable Development Goals, all against the background of climate change. This session will also build the business case for doing so, specifically by using the NPWI concept as a guiding North Star. We'll also discuss the tangible steps businesses can take now to set goals and take action to build water resilience. First, a little bit of context. We know that the climate crisis is actually a water crisis. We see this through intensifying floods and droughts with impacts to people, nature, businesses, and entire economies. In 2020, the SDG 6 Global Acceleration Framework found that we are significantly off track on reaching targets of SDG 6 for water and sanitation by 2030. 2.2 billion people still lack access to safe drinking water, and water protecting ecosystems have experienced rapid decline. Meanwhile, we know that the water crisis brings material risk to businesses, both through their direct operations and through their supply chains. And while many companies have announced net zero goals for climate, significantly fewer have set related water goals using a shared framework. We think it's time to do just that. As my colleague Jason Morrison, president of the Pacific Institute and head of the CEO Water Mandate, has said, it's time to ring the alarm bell on water. The good news, we believe business ambition on water using this net positive water impact concept and definition, as we will discuss today, can actually be a game changer. In positive developments, water has never had such a prominent role at COP, the UN Global Climate Change Conference, as it will at COP26 in Glasgow, starting in just a few days. Leaders, including investors and corporations, are showing increased interest in acting on water risks in the context of climate change. Our discussion here today could not be any more timely as we prepare for COP26. Now, a bit more context. The Water Resilience Coalition was launched on World Water Day in 2020 to elevate water stress to the top of corporate agendas. A keystone of the WRC is the acknowledgement that no single organization can tackle the global water crisis amid climate change alone. We must do this through collaboration and collective action involving businesses, civil society, and the public sector to have scalable impact in water-stressed regions. Today, this coalition includes 25 member companies from some of the most influential brands in the world, with total market cap of $3.28 trillion. NPWI was first conceptualized with this definition in 2019. Since then, the Water Resilience Coalition has socialized the idea that NPWI can do for water what other frameworks have already been doing for corporate action on climate. The UN Global Compact recognized the potential NPWI can play for elevating companies' ambition to drive this transformative change on water. As a result, in 2020, the UN Global Compact integrated the NPWI concept in its SDG ambition. Ultimately, this launched the new benchmark for what businesses can do to accelerate progress on achieving SDG 6 on water. Today, the Water Resilience Coalition calls on businesses to achieve net positive water impact to build resilience, both for their own operations and the communities and ecosystems in which they operate. More specifically, the WRC's ambition is to have positive water impact in more than 100 water-stressed basins that support more than 3 billion people. Before we begin, it's important to highlight one thing. While NPWI was first conceptualized with this definition in 2019, questions will and do continue to be asked and answered along the way. Indeed, NPWI is a journey, and we invite you to become part of that journey today. As this next slide shows, let's first review the agenda for today's session. We'll conduct this session in 5 parts. First, we'll take a deep dive into the technical aspects of the NPWI definition and concept. Then we'll explore what companies, including Heineken, are actually doing now on the ground to apply and achieve NPWI in practice. Next, as time allows, we'll take questions during an ending Q&A session featuring all 4 of our panelists. Please do share your questions at any time during the presentations using the Q&A feature or in the chat. We have experts available from the UN Global Compact, the CEO Water Mandate, the Water Resilience Coalition, and the Pacific Institute to help answer your questions. As shown on the next slide, before we jump in, let's introduce you to our speakers for the day. We will be joined by Sarah Shadid, Senior Associate of Ross Strategic, and Dr. Alexis Schaffler-Thompson, Engagement Manager for Pegasus. Later, during the moderated discussion, we'll be joined by Paul Reek, founder of Blue Risk, and Priti Sharma, Global Corporate Affairs Water Stewardship Lead for Heineken. Now let's turn to our first presentation for an overview of the operational elements and definition of NPWI. For that, we turn to Sarah Shadid of Ross Strategic and Dr. Alexis Schaffler-Thompson of Pegasus. Sarah and Alexis, if you could turn on your video, I'll turn things over to you.
Thanks, Amanda. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. As Amanda mentioned, my name is Sarah Shadid, and my firm, Ross Strategic, was brought on with another firm, Pegasus, to assist the Water Resilience Coalition in further developing and operationalizing the concept of net positive water impact, also referred to as NPWI. For today's presentation, I'll be tag teaming with Alexis from Pegasus to provide you all with an overview of how NPWI is oriented in relation to the Water Resilience Coalition 2050 Pledge and 2030 Ambition and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We'll also walk you through a definition for NPWI, its relationship to holistic basin health, and how companies can think about achieving NPWI. To close out, we'll provide you with a high-level overview of the operational framework for NPWI and how NPWI maps to existing resources. So with that, I will turn it over to Alexis.
Thanks, Sarah. As Sarah mentioned, we'll start orienting NPWI to show where the concept has come from within the ambitions of the WRC and the concept's links to the SDGs. On the next slide, I'm going to take you through our process in developing the concept and refining it from its initial foundations. The concepts are grounded in the initial development of NPWI by the WRC in 2020 and based in research on the wide variety of guidance and tools already used in the corporate water stewardship space. This information served as a foundation for developing a logic model that was presented to the WRC Matrix and Tracking Group to solicit initial feedback. Once the model had been refined on this feedback, we conducted 18 interviews to build out the concept further. Interviewees represented a spectrum of companies, from highly innovative and experienced to relative newcomers. Interviewees also included technical experts in the corporate water stewardship space. Most, but not all, interviewees were WRC members. The interviews were used to learn about corporate processes, to solicit feedback on the initial logic model that we were working with. That work and subsequent listening sessions has led to the development of the NPWI concept as described here today. On the next slide, we'll understand more about the WRC pledge. NPWI is one of the 3 WRC pledge pillars for water resilience, with an accompanying ambition to achieve 50% of the pledge targets by 2030. During the initial socialization of NPWI concepts, Concerns are raised about the need to incorporate value chains, governance, and other private and public actions as part of the NPWI aspiration. This image reinforces that the WRC recognizes the importance of this holistic relationship while allowing NPWI to focus on the specific actions in relation to the impacts of companies on the three dimensions of water stress: accessibility, quality, and availability. On the next slide, let's talk about some of the relationships between SDG 6 and NPWI. First, it's really important to understand NPWI as a cornerstone concept for achieving SDG 6. The anchors provided by SDG 6 provide the collectively agreed targets and goals towards 2050, as many of you will know. That is, the SDGs give guidance as to the desired outcome and the indicators to assess that outcome on a global level. The SDGs also indirectly inform the types of interventions that may impact accessibility, quality, and availability. The outcomes of NPWI are thus intended to contribute to the SDG outcomes and supporting a pathway towards fulfillment of the 2050 pledge. Importantly, the UN Global Compact ambition for enterprises to contribute to the SDGs is the final significant linkage that's gaining traction under the auspices of scaling business impact for the decade of action. This is really important, and as companies set up to set goals, we acknowledge that the SDG targets are an ongoing process and that the halfway mark will look different for everyone. Some enterprises may pick the low-hanging fruit first, some the more complex later. Let's talk about some of the interlinkages between the SDGs. NPWI focuses on the aspects of water stress that we've mentioned already, and these are directly tied to SDG 6. Specifically, NPWI targets SDG targets 6.1 through 6.4 as the specific targets and indicators that help enterprises think more strategically and specifically about how each dimension of water stress is potentially relevant to its water-related risks, impacts, or organizational influence. NPWI is also linked to SDG 6.5 and 6.6 as the enabling pathways to achieving NPWI through collective action. For example, Target 6.5, Integrated Water Resource Management, sets up a framework for companies and partners to address potential opportunities or conflicts between the targets associated with Goal 6. Things like transboundary cooperation and upstream or downstream uses are really relevant here. On the next slide, we'll show the visual demonstrating the connectivity between SDG 6 and the other goals. It's important to note that NPWI should not be done in a way that creates a negative outcome with another SDG goal, as the goals are naturally interlinked and mutually reinforcing. All goals need to support the dimensions of sustainable development. Additionally, in the same way that there are important co-benefits and co-considerations like climate mitigation and food security, these might not be directly tackled by NPWI. Yet, in the spirit of the SDGs, when companies make NPWI interventions, they will look to optimize and consider these co-benefits with their investments. The next section takes us through some of the conceptual foundations and how the NPWI concept has evolved in our work. The definition shown on the next slide is consistent with that was originally developed by the WRC in 2020, but it's been refined to emphasize the critical place-based nature of NPWI contributions within water-stressed basins. To highlight the working definition that we are presenting, is that it's NPWI when it's achieved with contributions. Sorry, let me start that again. To highlight the working definition of NPWI, NPWI is achieved when contributions exceed direct operational footprint impacts relative to the impacts on water stress, and these contributions need to be maintained. It's important to note that this is an evolving body of work and that we have established a baseline that will need testing over time. On the next slide, we'll take you through some of the further foundations in the concept. In the meetings with interviewees and through reviewing the current landscape of methodologies and approaches, we kept bumping up against the question of how is NPWI different from current water stewardship practice by WRC companies. Where we've landed is that NPWI is not simply a practice, but a purpose, as Amanda mentioned earlier. It creates an orientation that focuses water stewardship efforts in areas of greatest need, i.e. water-stressed basins. It also boosts the scope and depth of water stewardship to include a positive operational footprint within all water-stressed basins, as I mentioned on the previous slide. Finally, it orients a company's water ambition and effort with SDG 6, as we mentioned earlier. In terms of basin health, there are a couple of dimensions that we need to highlight. This is that basin health cannot be achieved through the action of NPWI actions alone. Public sector actors, other private actors, governance, and people in the public policy and stewardship space all play a key role in achieving and sustaining holistic basin health. So now I'd like to present some of the principles of NPWI that were distilled from our interviews and building on existing resources and guidance. First, NPWI is an enterprise ambition that manifests in water-stressed basins as priority basins to create impact where it matters most. Secondly, NPWI is a quantifiable aspiration against the dimensions of water stress, and it uses well-established methodologies to measure both short-term outputs and long-term outcomes. An enterprise also achieves NPWI through a combination of its own operational investments, but also through partnerships and initiatives within the basin. When we spoke with interviewees, there was an acknowledgement that positive impact is unlikely to be achieved without going beyond the factory fence. And this will only take place within collective action efforts. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Alexis. So now that we've oriented and defined NPWI, we'd like to provide greater detail on what it means for a company to achieve NPWI. So let's start with an example. As Alexis mentioned, NPWI applies to priority basins experiencing water stress. And NPWI covers all three dimensions of water stress. It does not include basins that are not stressed. So here you'll see that a company may have operations in both stressed and not stressed basins, but efforts will be targeted within stress basins. In this example, the company decides to first address all of their impacts on water stress in one basin. So this company has not achieved full NPWI, but they've taken a first step in their journey. So let's look at a second example. In this example, the company takes a different approach. The company decides to address one dimension of water stress first, availability. And here, the company decides to tackle all of their impacts relative to availability in all their priority basins as the first step in their journey. However, we realize that those first two examples provide really clear-cut approaches to NPWI, but we heard from many companies that this journey is not as straightforward as one basin or one dimension of water stress first. Rather, we heard from companies that they are often seeking to address impacts based on priority or opportunity. So for this reason, a company's journey may look more like this example here on your screen. And I also want to point out that there's a not applicable under availability in the third priority basin. This is meant to convey that even if a basin is experiencing water stress, they may not be experiencing all three dimensions of water stress. So this basin does not have an availability gap, and the company will focus efforts on reducing impact relative to accessibility and quality. So those three examples are all legitimate pathways to NPWI, but the goal is that by 2050, companies will have a positive impact on all three water stress dimensions relative to the footprint of direct operations within all stress basins. So the visual you now see on this screen is an example of a company that has achieved full NPWI. So next, I want to talk about expectations of NPWI. These expectations reflect our current understanding of how to consistently apply NPWI principles across companies. A company must consider its direct operational impact on all three dimensions of water stress, not only on the more easily quantifiable aspects or low-hanging fruit. A company must include all water stress basins in which they operate in NPWI efforts. Additionally, water stress dimensions are not interchangeable. For example, a company cannot replenish to neutral and then implement wash interventions to claim positive. A company cannot claim NPWI if it is overperforming in some water stress basins and underperforming in others, So that is to say, no amount of positive work within one basin can erase negative impacts a company may have in another basin. Finally, NPWI is a journey, and there's a lot to do. On this journey, companies will need to address the dimensions of stress they impact in stressed basins through prioritization and sequencing. So, what types of claims should and should not be made for NPWI at this time? First and foremost, NPWI is an effort companies carry out within a specific geography. As such, claims should be place-based in nature, similar to the claim here on the screen. And given the complexity of inputs and sourcing for products and accurately footprinting for direct operations, WRC members are currently discouraged from describing products, processes, or an enterprise as NPWI. So next, I'm going to provide you with a high-level overview of the draft elements of the NPWI operational framework. From research and interviews, a set of key operational elements began to emerge. And these elements, when taken together, provide a strong basis for a company to ensure its water contributions create a positive impact. There are 9 elements altogether, and they are organized into 3 distinct phases: plan, design, and act. So first is phase 1, plan. At this phase, a company will establish enterprise footprint and impact relative to all 3 stress dimensions. An enterprise also outlines its ambition with scope, rationale, and focus for its NPWI aspiration. And I want to note that these 2 elements are highly iterative. Next is phase 2. This is the design phase. In this phase, a company will identify enterprise targets and begin refining their understanding of the basins they are active within. To do this, they will likely use global and local data sets, as well as company information on current operations and future growth. Basin prioritization varies greatly depending on company and industry context, and there are a number of technical partners and tools to assist in identifying priority basins and understanding basin context. After the design phase, a company moves into the act phase, where they will implement their chosen interventions, monitor outputs and outcomes to assess impact, and communicate efforts. It is likely that companies will sequence the elements of NPWI differently, depending on company context and ambition. For example, in the design phase, some companies may choose to start by assessing basin context and set individual basin targets first. Once they have established those individual basin targets, they may sum those up to the enterprise level target. Other companies may choose to set enterprise targets first and then allocate that target within individual basins. So NPWI allows for this company-specific tailoring because its importance is in the completion of the elements, not in the sequencing. So finally, we'd like to provide you with a crosswalk of some of the well-established methodologies and their applicability to specific elements of NPWI. So this slide and the following provide a crosswalk of existing tools and methods and their applicability to the elements. I want to note that this list is not exhaustive, but we've included methodologies that are frequently mentioned or referenced in the water stewardship and positive water impact space. I should also note that there are many advanced practice companies that have established and implemented their own methodologies that are not captured on this list. In fact, there were so many applicable resources that we had to split this into 2 slides. So this visual is included to emphasize that these methods are all legitimate pathways to NPWI if the result of the effort is that the company's water contributions exceed impacts on all 3 dimensions of water stress across operational footprint. That is to say, NPWI is a North Star, and companies may choose from a wide variety of methods that have directional alignment to NPWI. So thanks for your time today, everyone. And I'll now turn it back to Amanda to discuss the application of NPWI with Paul and Prithi in greater detail. Amanda, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Alexis. We'll look forward to seeing you both back here in a few minutes for our Q&A session. Next, we'll turn the page from the concept and definition of NPWI to how it is actually applied by real companies on the ground. For that, we turn to Paul Rieg of Blue Risk and Priti Sharma of Heineken. Following their presentations, we'll have a moderated conversation to follow up with questions. Speaking of questions, please do continue to share your questions with us. We have experts standing by from the UN Global Compact, CEO Water Mandate, Water Resilience Coalition, and the Pacific Institute to answer your questions in real time in the chat. Some questions will also be featured in the Q&A discussion with our panelists at the end of today's session. With that, let's turn it over to you, Paul.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. So as Amanda mentioned, my name's Paul Rieg. I'm the founder of a company called Blue Risk, and we work with the private sector to help identify exposure to water-related challenges across corporate value chains, and then provide recommendations and strategies to respond to those challenges and pursue opportunities related to water for the companies. And I wanted to share our experience working with companies and how they're applying the concepts outlined today around net positive water impact, and more broadly also how companies are pursuing an ambition or goals to have a positive impact on water. So the next slide outlines kind of three main components of corporate programs that we're seeing implemented to have a positive impact on water resources. The first one is the ambition of the company, and that's primarily set and determined at an enterprise level. And it helps you answer questions such as, why is water important to my organization? Why does it matter to my company? What am I going to do about water, right? What's my role as a company, as an organization, in addressing issues and opportunities related to water? And where am I going to focus, right? What watersheds am I going to be active in pursuing that ambition? So that's kind of the first component that we're seeing companies develop and implement if they want to have a positive impact on water. Some key trends that we're seeing as companies define their ambition for water is that they start by looking at the full value chain and looking at where they're exposed to risks, where they're having impacts, and where they have a dependency on water. Everywhere from raw material sourcing to suppliers to operations, all the way to consumers and the customers they service. The other key trend is that companies are really following what we typically call the 80-20 rule when it comes to data and analysis, which basically means don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? Start with what you know. Start with where the impacts are greatest, where you have most visibility, and move along into having a meaningful impact and taking action without letting data and analysis kind of slow you down. It's going to be very hard to have good visibility into all aspects related to water across a corporate value chain, particularly for multinational organizations operating around the world. So follow the 80-20 rule. Start with what you know. Use proxy data or model data. Just to understand where you need to focus and move into the next phase of having action. The other key trend and the ambition is companies are really striving to align their ambition on water and their objective of having a positive impact on watersheds with other business objectives. And that's proven to be really valuable in gaining traction internally, right? If you can demonstrate how pursuing an ambition to have a positive impact on water is also delivering on other objectives, whether those be around business growth, around business continuity, procurement, marketing, sales, other environmental commitments. It just really helps strengthen the business case for action on water. And then lastly, to achieve that, the best way is to really engage internally, right? As you define your ambition, as you define what you want to do on water, talk and listen to folks across the organization in different functions to see how you can add value to their work and further their objectives to really make sure that your work on water is integrated and embedded into the core of the business. So that's that first kind of area of practice. The second main one is around, this is really where the rubber hits the road, is around action, right? Taking action where it matters most at the watershed level. And companies start to take action in those watersheds that they've identified as they define their ambition. And they, in order to do that in a meaningful way, really need to understand what are the shared challenges in those watersheds. What are stakeholder priorities? How can you align with those? How can you address those shared challenges? And we heard a little bit about that already in the previous presentation. What are the opportunities, right? How do you identify valuable opportunities for you to contribute to in those watersheds, right? What's a high value opportunity? How can you have an impact in a positive way? And then lastly, how are you going to finance those interventions to deliver on that impact? How are you going to implement solutions? Who are you going to work with? How are you going to select partners? So all of that is part of that action component that's critical for implementing a water positive commitment or an ambition to have a positive impact on water. Some key trends there that we're seeing from practitioners. More and more companies are sharing the list of priority watersheds that they focus on. If nothing else, to invite others to join as well and have more organizations to collaborate with. I think that's really important. Engaging and collaborating with stakeholders really early on in the journey is absolutely critical. If you want to have a positive impact, you can only achieve it if you work with others, right? Water is a shared resource. The challenges are shared. There's no way that you're going to be, able to solve those issues on your own. You need to engage stakeholders really early on, listen, work with them, potentially build on efforts that are already underway. So that's something else that's really central to what we're seeing. A lot of companies are choosing to set targets to help drive their ambition. And those targets, we're seeing more and more of them being contextual or context-based and being set at the watershed level, right? Either for a site or for an ingredient or for a sourcing area. So that's something else we're seeing a lot. It helps, really drive action and help folks at the local level have something to aim towards. And then lastly, on the action piece, and I can't emphasize this enough, we're really seeing a bias for engaging in external actions outside the four walls of the company. There's only so many things you can do within the four walls of your organization. The opportunities to drive meaningful change, most of them are going to be outside your four walls in the watershed. And they also happen to be the ones with the most attractive return on investment in terms of dollars in and value created and impact coming out on the other side. So that's something else we're seeing a really strong trend around. And then lastly, if you want to make any claims around having a positive impact, you need to have a very strong component focused on measurement. Also at the watershed level, right? How are you going to monitor and evaluate the performance of your interventions in a credible way? How can you share results? How can you share what you've learned? How can you demonstrate that you're having a positive impact in a watershed, right? So it's really important to have a strong focus on measurement. And it's also important to measure so that you can learn and through those learnings, you can improve how you engage, how you drive interventions, and over time adapt to a changing landscape from an environmental perspective, but also from a social and economic perspective. Things change over time. So, the only way to adapt is by learning, and you can't learn unless you measure your performance. So measurement also critical. Some key trends there is one, we need to embrace uncertainty at many levels, but particularly when you think about measuring impact, right? The performance of a project or an intervention, it's never going to really play out exactly how you think it will, right? Particularly on water, right? It's a natural resource. There are a lot of variables, many of which are very dynamic over space and time. So, embrace the fact that what you set out to do might not actually play out exactly how you thought it would. So there's a certain amount of uncertainty that you have to acknowledge up front and communicate around. There's a big adoption of volumetric water benefit accounting methods and metrics. There's a lot of alignment around indicators and methods for doing that. We're seeing in our work an increasing interest, particularly from a lot of the companies we're working with, and not just measuring volumetric benefits and impacts, but also societal benefits and carbon benefits of interventions related to water to watershed level, right? There's a lot of opportunities to deliver on carbon reduction and also on societal benefits as you deliver implementation of solutions related to water. And then lastly, companies more and more want to publish and share their learnings, right? As we've said quite a few times already, these are shared resources. Water is a shared resource. There's a lot to gain from sharing what we learned so that others can build on that and accelerate, meaningful actions, meaningful interventions that build on what we've learned in the past. So This is what we're seeing is maybe common practice isn't the right word, but maybe you'd say maybe leading practice or practice from companies that are really trying to implement actions that ultimately have a positive impact on water resources. And again, maybe just to emphasize, this information here is a huge oversimplification of everything companies are doing. I tried to really bring it down to a few things, and these are the ones I came up with. But I acknowledge that there's a lot more detail under each one of these that needs to be unpacked and acknowledged when you embark in this journey. And the next slide I wanted to reflect a little bit on key insights and maybe lessons learned. I've spent at this point, close to 15 years working with companies on corporate water stewardship strategies and really on implementing programs that deliver positive impacts. And there's a lot of things that I think are worth flagging that we've learned over the years and we continue to learn. The first one is there's more than one way to skin the cat. And I'm sorry for those of you that have a cat, and no disrespect to cats, but there's more than one way to achieve this. And I think that's really important as you embark in your journey to have a positive impact on water, right? Your industry, your stakeholders, the culture of your company, the size and distribution of your value chain, all of that really influences how you're going to be able to have a positive impact on water resources. So, don't go into this thinking that there's, one way to do it and you have to follow that one way, but rather think of it as, how can I leverage my organization and our strengths as an organization and our footprint and our risk profile to have a real meaningful impact. And every industry is very different. You have different impacts and risks and dependencies on water, and you operate in different places around the world. So all of that needs to be considered as you set out to implement a commitment to have a positive impact, and recognize that you need to find an approach that works for you and your stakeholders. And that's going to be very different across companies and across organizations and sectors. The second one is, I already touched on this, but I can't emphasize enough the importance of engaging stakeholders, right? If you want to have an impact, stakeholder consultation needs to be front and center from day one. You're just, I can tell you right now, you're not going to achieve it if you don't. It's as clear as that. And you need to engage stakeholders at a global level, particularly if you're a global operator, a global multinational, but also at a regional level and a local level, right? Where you're operating or where you're sourcing from and where you want to have an impact. So that's just, to me, it's almost like an enabling condition. It has to be there. The next one is think long-term. These issues have really been, building up over a long time, over many years, and it's not, we're not going to fix them overnight. So if you're engaging in corporate water stewardship or corporate stewardship more broadly, and you want to have a positive impact, you need to think long-term, right? Your investments, your engagements, your programs, this is a long-term journey. And you need to be very open to learning and adapting over time as we learn more. And then lastly, this is about having a positive impact. I mean, the name itself is clear, but let's not forget that. Don't get hung up on terminology. Don't get hung up on analysis. You'll end up slowing down. You'll end up, really not making progress towards having an impact. When you set out to implement one of these commitments, keep that in mind. This is about improving watershed health. It's about strengthening your credibility as an actor with stakeholders, and it's ultimately about reducing your exposure to risk. So keep that in mind. That's what we're aiming to do with this, and I'm happy to take questions afterwards. So over to you, Amanda.
Great, Paul. Thank you so much for that presentation, and we'll look forward to having you back for some Q&A later in our session today. Now, as we move on, let's take a look into the details of how one specific company is applying NPWI, the concept and the definitions. We're very fortunate to be able to introduce you today to Prithi Sharma of Heineken. Prithi?
Thank you, Amanda. Hello, everyone. I'm Prithi, the Water Stewardship Manager at Heineken. Just a bit of background on Heineken. We are an international brewer that has breweries in 165 countries and has over 300 brands. Now, if you observe a glass or a pint of beer, what you would see is it's mostly liquid, and 90% of a pint of beer is actually water. So it is an important part for our product as well as growing our crops. Now, if you go to the next slide, in 2019, we actually launched our water strategy, where we implement a triangular approach when it comes to watershed protection. What it means is we combine internal optimization efforts, which is working on water efficiency internally, and also water circularity, where we treat our wastewater to highest quality. And of course, implementing also the external effort to promote water security, where we work on watershed stewardship. This can be through nature-based solution at the watershed or infrastructure improvement. Now, if we move to the next slide, what I will also show you is, in order to understand what is our water risk around the world, we have a three-step approach in place. Firstly, as an annual basis, we try to have an annual assessment that is led by our local team to understand the water quantity, quality, and accessibility issues on site. Now, every 5 years, then we'll conduct a global water risk screening where we use World Resources Institute Aqueduct, as well as a satellite data to understand the list of sites that are located in water stress area. Now, as an additional step, what we also do is we engage a third party with a hydrology background to come up with a source vulnerability assessment. It's basically a detailed report on the water risk, intervention, as well as watershed vulnerabilities that are in place to help the organization to decide what needs to be done in the future. Now, by using this three-step approach, in the next slide, I can show you that we have identified 30 sites that are located in 12 countries that are actually located in water stress areas. Now, what it means is these 30 sites would need to then implement a contextual water targets, because as we know, watersheds are unique from one to another. Now, if I can show you the next flow chart in the following slide, this is more for a simple visualization on how we support healthy watershed. We take the water from the watershed, water provider, or surface water. We then use the water for consumption of our production. And the idea behind this is we use as little water as possible. And we have an ambitious target on water efficiency. And as of 2020, we have managed to improve our water efficiency by 33%. Now, at the end of the life cycle of the water, we ensure that the wastewater is actually treated to the highest quality and compliant to the local regulations. Of course, the new untapped opportunity that we are exploring at this point of time is to kind of give a new life to the wastewater, basically opportunities for on-site and off-site circularity. And as an example, in Egypt, for example, the wastewater that comes out from our brewery is treated to a certain extent and used for irrigation for woody trees, which helps to reduce the withdrawal of fresh water. Now, at the same time, if we look below where the icon of glass of beer that you can see, water that are not returned to the watershed is then replenished to water through water balancing program, which addresses the watershed vulnerabilities. And the key component, which the other speakers have said, and Paul has reinstated again, is you need to have a collective action with multiple stakeholders at the watershed. If not, the project will not be as sustainable as you think it would be. And finally, by incorporating and managing the internal and external impact, we then create a positive water impact at the watershed, which means more water is actually replenished than the water usage at the production. Now, let me illustrate it further with two case studies in the following slide. Now, we have two case studies, one in Mexico, where we focus on positive impact on availability, while the other is positive impact on accessibility, availability, and quality. If you can see in Mexico, there are 4 different water stress basins, yet we only focus on availability for now. Reason being is the site in Mexico, for example, is currently heavily deforested. There's abuse of groundwater usage on site. Hence, the focused effort that needed right now is to ensure there are large-scale reforestation and soil conservation in place to ensure that the water cycle in the area would improve over the years. Now, in terms of local sourcing, we also work closely with farmers to ensure that there are sustainable barley cultivation, in which we actually have achieved reduced water usage when cultivating barley, which also then connects back to our business. Now, if we move to the case study in Malaysia, the external efforts then has, for example, rainwater harvesting system for the local community, because that's one of the issues at the watershed area. In addition to that, we also try to construct clay dikes in forest reserves to increase the quantity. And finally, where the wastewater is released, we ensure that there are river rehabilitation program in place because, for example, in Malaysia, rivers are quite an important water catchment area for consumption. Now, the similarities between these two case studies are the internal efforts on efficiency and wastewater treatment. And the similarities on external efforts is that you would need to collaborate with multi-stakeholders. In Mexico, for example, we work with more than 40 partners and have established a water fund to ensure that the project is sustained for a longer term beyond 2030. And in Malaysia, similarly, we started the project back in 2000, and the project is still ongoing up to 2030. And as Paul has mentioned, when you work on water balancing or water stewardship project, it will be a multi-year, multi-stakeholder project. Now, in 2019, we then said, okay, you know what, we need to start calculating and understanding the water impact from the external efforts. So we use a science-based method to measure external efforts, which is the volumetric water benefit accounting by the World Resources Institute. And yes, it has tremendously helped us to understand the gap analysis and the plan to way forward for a better watershed protection program. Now, in my final slides, I just wanted to share some lessons that we have learned over the last decade. The first 3 points is mainly related to stakeholder. It is so important to have proper stakeholder mapping and engagement in place, from credible implementing partner to collaboration with government agencies to tap upon their resources and data points. And finally, collective action with other funding partners that are also benefiting from the watershed health. And the final 3 points is measurement, tapping upon the wastewater. And last point that I want to leave you with is, it may seem difficult, but we need to start small, start somewhere and improvise along the way. And Amanda, back to you.
Kriti, thank you so much for that presentation. I'm now going to invite all 4 panelists to join us back here as we move into the Q&A session, featuring some questions from you, our attendees of today's session. For that, we welcome back all 4 of our panelists, and I'd like to kick it off with a broad-based question. Many companies have water ambition and may seek to develop their own frameworks or goals for achieving it. Why do you all think it's so critical to have a shared framework with shared definitions, such as that provided by NPWI, that really gets companies moving in the same direction rather than having each company go at it alone?
Happy to chime in. Yeah, I think we heard a few times, because water resources are shared resources, having a common language that companies can all relate to and speak to across industries, across geographies, is extremely powerful in guiding more coordination, right, across the private sector in how and where we address these issues, right? So I think to me that's the number one benefit. It creates a set of common terms and language that just makes collaboration and alignment and communication around this a lot easier for internal stakeholders, but also for external stakeholders to understand. Yeah, so I don't know if others wanted to add.
Amanda, let me add
Alexis,
to that. I think,
yeah.
Thanks, Amanda. To add to that, in the spirit of cooperation, coordination, a lot of the areas that we're seeing particularly critical to the SDGs, one of the key insights from our interviews was there's a lot happening. As I mentioned, there are, innovators and companies that are really catalyzing innovation in the space, and there are others who are learning by doing. And so I think there's a lot to be said about using this as that North Star to share those lessons and create an environment that is a shared learning environment that is not going to be, cornering for companies. So I think there's a real benefit in that kind of experimental approach that's being advocated here. And it's really through testing these pilots and through testing examples that collaboration can be fostered.
Thank you, Alexis. Let's move on to another question from our group of attendees today. Many of you spoke about the power of collaboration and the need for stakeholder engagement and collaboration. Some questions have come up about how to engage with partners, how to understand who your collaborators are. Prithi, you mentioned in Mexico that you had more than 40 partners on a project. Maybe you could walk us through how you found those partners and what your methods were for connecting with them.
Yeah, sure thing. I think the first step is to understand what is your organization water risk. So as I mentioned, we have a 3-step approach to identify that. And with the data points, you then need to identify who are the stakeholders involved in the watershed area and close to your brewery. Once you have the stakeholders involved, then you will need to understand what are the common missions you want to address together. Of course, getting a collective action, it took 2 years to form in Mexico to get this 40 different partners. But eventually, when these partners came on board, the implementation process was quite fast. So we started with an credible personnel from Mexico who's quite influential, who has a very good network with the local government agencies and community. We also worked with the Nature Conservancy to understand how stakeholder engagement could work. And that's how we started. We started small. Eventually, one partner became 4, 4 became 10, 10 became 20, and 40, because you start to see the results evolving in the site. And it's so important that you work with different stakeholders, because imagine a glass and there's 10 people drinking off the glass. If one person stopped drinking off the glass, the water is still going to be reducing, hence the need of collective action at the watershed area.
And Amanda, if I could just add to that and emphasize something that Prithi talked about. In our interviews with a lot of these companies, we heard the value of when you get started, it can be really intimidating to create that network on your own. So see who's active in the basin, try and get attached to existing initiatives. And it might be okay to cut your teeth on kind of a shovel-ready project. So another company or an organizer such as the Nature Conservancy may have an initiative that they need additional contributions to. And so getting in, figuring out what's going on and kind of getting your footing with an already existing initiative can be a great way to introduce yourself to other actors in the basin and to kind of pick up speed for a more ambitious project in step 2.
And I have to take this opportunity to share a terrific resource from the CEO Water Mandate, the Water Action Hub, which we've dropped a link to in the chat, is a wonderful framework to connect with partners on collective action. And I hope those of you watching will take a look at the chat. We'll also share that resource in the email that follows today's discussion. Let's move on to one other question that came up quite a bit from participants today. The decision about how to decide whether or not to bring the whole value chain to be included into NPWI. Would anybody like to talk about how that decision can be made, whether to only look at NPWI within a company's own direct operations, or whether to extend that to the entire value chain?
I'm happy to share kind of what our experience has been in helping organizations make that decision. I think it comes down to one thing basically, which is you want to make sure that your claim to having a positive impact is credible. And while it may be complex, if your greatest impact is outside of your direct operations and your supply chain, your commitment to having a positive impact has to include that area of your organization for it to be truly credible and truly meaningful commitment. But our experience has been that that's been the biggest deciding factor, right? Understand where your impacts are, where your dependency on water is, and make sure that your commitments and your ambitions are inclusive of that area of the value chain. And I'm talking here about companies pursuing commitments to have a positive impact beyond the WRC, beyond the Water Resilience Coalition. I know that the work and kind of approach and scope of the Water Resilience Coalition is evolving. So that my comments and observations were based on experience beyond the companies that are part of that group.
Thank you, Paul. And I will mention there has been some questioning about how to become involved in the Water Resilience Coalition. And again, that information is in the chat, and we'll include links in the follow-up email after today's session. Another question that has come up among participants today has to do with the size of a company that might make sense to engage in this NPWI work. Do you all have thoughts on, is there a certain size a company needs to be before it becomes involved in the NPWI journey?
I think,
sorry.
Priti, do you want to take this?
No worries, Alexis, go ahead.
Priti might have some practical insight here, but I think, you know, as we mentioned, we interviewed a range of companies, and it's clear that there's momentum across the board. So I think at a baseline, you know, to exclude different sized companies isn't in the spirit of the NPWI commitment. However, it does enable the process to learn from existing practice and you know, as Sarah mentioned, where companies have cut their teeth. So I guess the question is also, you know, if you're a small company, how can you learn from others in your sector, and what kind of lessons could that hold for your kind of assessment using established methodologies? And I think that's another key point, as Paul just spoke to. You know, it has to have credibility. So finding what is used in tools and the lessons in those tools can be really important for that element of credibility. Priti, over to you.
Yeah, sure thing. Earlier, I shared the two examples of Mexico and Malaysia. Just to share with you, in terms of size of the organization, Mexico is actually 25 times bigger than Malaysia. So what then the Malaysia OPCO did was to learn from the bigger organization and best practices from around the world. And the Water Action Hub is actually a fantastic resource to kind of just gauge the type of projects that you could explore at your site at a small scale or a large scale. That's first. And then the second thing is just to understand what are the existing projects at your watershed that's ongoing. You don't have to start one from scratch, but you could just join and form a collective action with other partners and, you know, return the impact that you are creating through this particular collective action.
Thank you, Alexis and Priti. We have time for one more question, and then we're going to close out our session today. I think it might be relevant to just say for participants today who are considering taking that very first step toward net positive water impact, what are your thoughts on what that very first step should be to engage in this work?
I'll jump in here and just speak from our interviews. The number one thing that we heard is that a company needs to understand why they're taking the action. So the rationale for engaging, and that purpose, that rationale will guide what happens after that. So it's not just about understanding your use, but it's about really grounding yourself in the why and then moving from that. But I'll defer to others on the speaker video.
I agree with Sarah. You need to really understand you know, how this is adding value to your organization and why you're doing it.
All right. Well, thank you to you all for participating in today's session and sharing answers during this Q&A. We appreciate the time you've taken to share your information today about net positive water impact. I'd like to move forward with a few takeaways now. During this UN Academy session, we've covered the origin and the technical aspects of this definition of net positive water impact, or NPWI. We've also explored how companies, including Heineken and others, are applying NPWI in practice today. Here are a few other key takeaways from today's session. First, we learned that NPWI serves as a guiding North Star for water stewardship programs. It also directly aligns company ambitions with SDG 6. We also learned that delivering NPWI contributes to reducing water stress in 3 specific dimensions: availability, quality, and accessibility. NPWI is also achieved through combination of both investments in an enterprise's own direct operations and through collective action partnerships within basins, with collaboration being key. We learned that having a credible and influential implementing partner can be a critical success factor for implementing NPWI. And we learned that companies need to consider their unique contexts, prioritize early stakeholder consultation, and think in the long term. This is a journey and an iterative process. Moving along to resources, there are a number of resources available to support companies' NPWI journey. We will be emailing each of you some of these following the session, along with a link to the video recording. They include today's first presentation from Sarah and Alexis. You'll also receive a link to the SDG Ambition Benchmark document specifically related to NPWI. With that, we'd like to thank the UN Global Compact Academy, today's presenters, the CEO Water Mandate, the Water Resilience Coalition, and the Pacific Institute for making today possible. And we thank each of you for joining us today.